On October 14, 1912, Theodore Roosevelt stepped onto a stage in Milwaukee with a bullet lodged inside his chest. Just moments earlier, a gunman had shot him at close range. The folded 50-page speech in his pocket and his steel eyeglass case had slowed the bullet enough to save his life. Blood was visible through his shirt. His advisors begged him to go immediately to a hospital. Any rational calculation pointed in one direction: stop, rest, survive. Roosevelt did the opposite. He stood before the crowd, raised a trembling hand, and calmly announced that he had just been shot. Then he delivered a speech for nearly 90 minutes. Not because he felt fearless, not because pain had disappeared, not because some heroic emotion had flooded his body. In fact, witnesses described him as pale, strained, visibly weakened. He was not operating from comfort, inspiration, or confidence. He was acting from something far more disturbing and far more powerful. A decision already made long before the bullet ever entered his body. Most people misunderstand strength. They imagine it arrives as a sensation, a state, a rush of certainty. They think discipline belongs to those who wake up with fire in their chest and clarity in their mind. But history keeps humiliating that fantasy. Again and again, the people who appear strongest are often acting while internally fragmented, exhausted, doubtful, or afraid, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if strength has almost nothing to do with how you feel in the moment? What if the people you admire most are not stronger because they feel different from you, but because they have built something inside themselves that no emotional weather can negotiate with? And if that is true, then almost everything you currently believe about confidence may be backwards. There is a private humiliation few people talk about openly. It is not failure itself. Failure can be clean, honest, external. The deeper humiliation is promising yourself something simple and watching yourself betray it. Tomorrow I start. This time I mean it. Just 20 minutes. Just one page. Just one workout. Just one conversation I've been avoiding. The promise is almost always small enough to feel harmless, reasonable, even trivial. And yet somehow, hours later, days later, weeks later, the promise lies abandoned like debris from another version of you. At first, this seems insignificant. A missed alarm, a skipped task, a delayed commitment, nothing dramatic. But psychologically, something far more corrosive is happening beneath the surface. Every time you repeatedly witness yourself creating intentions you do not honor, a fracture forms. Not in your schedule, not in your productivity system, in your identity. A silent negotiation begins between who you say you are and what your nervous system has learned to expect from you. Soon, a subtle distrust emerges. You stop fully believing your own declarations. Not because you consciously decide to become cynical, but because your brain is collecting evidence. Evidence that your words are cheap, that your plans are emotional weather, that your future promises carry no binding force. This is why so many people are not exhausted from work itself, but from the exhausting instability of self-contradiction. They are not fighting laziness. They are living inside a collapsing relationship with themselves. And once that internal contract erodes, even simple tasks begin to feel strangely heavy. Not because they are objectively difficult, but because every small action has become entangled with a much larger question. Can I trust myself at all? What makes this problem so deceptive is that most people search for the solution in the wrong place. They chase emotional optimization, a better mood, a more inspiring morning routine, a cleaner environment, a stronger burst of motivation, a perfect mindset before beginning. They endlessly reorganize the external conditions surrounding action, convinced that somewhere, hidden behind the correct playlist, the correct notebook, the correct philosophy, there exists a version of themselves that will finally become consistent. But consistency built on emotional convenience is structurally fragile. It survives only under favorable weather. The moment boredom arrives, the moment discomfort enters, the moment friction appears, the entire system begins to shake. This is why some people seem endlessly trapped in cycles of reinvention. New goals, new systems, new declarations, same collapse. What they are missing is both brutally simple and psychologically difficult to accept. Your nervous system does not care about your intentions. It updates its beliefs through repeated evidence. Not what you want, not what you imagine, not what you announce. What you repeatedly do when no emotional reward is immediately available. This changes everything, because it means the version of you that feels uncertain, tired, distracted, emotionally flat, uninspired, and resistant is not an obstacle to your development. That version is the training ground, the laboratory, the proving environment, and hidden inside that realization is an unsettling kind of freedom. You may have spent years trying to become someone else before taking action. But what if action itself is the mechanism that builds the person you have been waiting to become? What you are about to uncover is not comforting. It is far more useful than comfort. There is a paradox at the center of human change that most people spend years resisting. You do not begin trusting yourself after proving you are exceptional. You begin trusting yourself after proving you are predictable. Not impressive, not intense, not transformed overnight. Predictable. Someone who does what was decided, even when the emotional vote changes. This sounds almost insultingly small. Too ordinary to matter. Too repetitive to be meaningful. And yet this is precisely where most internal instability is either healed or permanently reinforced. Because every unnoticed decision is casting a vote. Not toward a goal, toward a self-concept. Every time you follow through under friction, something invisible hardens. Something stabilizes. A layer of internal negotiation disappears. But every time you abandon yourself in small ways, the opposite occurs. Not dramatic collapse. Something quieter. A soft erosion. Like water carving weakness into stone. This is why the real battle was never against external difficulty. It was against inconsistency in your own relationship with discomfort. Most people are waiting for confidence to arrive before they begin building their life. But this may be the fatal inversion. What if confidence is not the cause of aligned action, but its delayed consequence? What if the feeling you have been desperately trying to manufacture cannot be accessed directly at all? And if confidence only appears after repeated acts of self-loyalty, then one disturbing question remains. How much of your current identity is not who you are, but simply the accumulated memory of promises you stopped keeping? In the late 1960s, inside a nursery school on the Stanford University campus, a series of deceptively simple experiments began to reveal something deeply unsettling about human behavior. Psychologist Walter Mischel invited young children into a small room. There was no dramatic machinery, no punishment, no authority figure threatening consequences. Just a table, a chair, and a single marshmallow placed directly in front of them. The instruction was simple. The child could eat the marshmallow immediately, or wait alone for a short period of time and receive a second one as a reward. That was all. No philosophical dilemma. No moral lecture. No grand life decision. And yet what unfolded inside those small rooms was almost painfully human. Some children stared directly at the marshmallow as if hypnotized by it. Others touched it, smelled it, leaned dangerously close to it. Some covered their eyes with their hands, spun in their chairs, sang to themselves, kicked the table, or physically turned their bodies away from temptation as if trying to escape an invisible force. They were not resisting sugar. They were confronting time, confronting the gap between desire and restraint, between impulse and decision, between what feels good now and what serves you later. This is where most people misunderstand self-control. They imagine discipline as a battle against major temptations. Addiction, excess, destruction. But often the real battle is absurdly small. A tiny discomfort, a brief urge, a few minutes of internal friction. And inside that microscopic conflict, entire futures quietly begin to take shape. Not because one marshmallow determines a life, but because how you relate to immediate discomfort may be revealing something far more predictive than anyone originally expected. The footage became famous for a reason. Watching children struggle against something so trivial is strangely uncomfortable, almost embarrassing. Not because the challenge is impressive, but because it feels painfully familiar. A child reaches toward the marshmallow, stops, retracts the hand, waits, looks again, negotiates silently with themselves. You can almost see the invisible dialogue unfolding. Just one bite. No one is watching. It's small. It doesn't matter. And this is precisely why the experiment cuts deeper than it first appears. Because adult life rarely collapses through catastrophic decisions. It erodes through these exact moments. The skipped workout, the delayed conversation, the abandoned routine, the unnecessary purchase, the endless scrolling, the tiny surrender justified because the consequence seems harmless. One moment feels irrelevant, but repeated over years, these moments become architecture, patterns, identity. Mischel later followed many of these children over time. Early findings suggested that those who delayed gratification tended to show stronger academic performance, better stress tolerance, and more effective coping behaviors later in life. The interpretation became culturally explosive. Perhaps success was not mainly intelligence, not luck, not raw talent, but the ability to tolerate the psychological discomfort of not immediately satisfying desire. This was both empowering and disturbing. Empowering because it suggested self-regulation mattered. Disturbing because it exposed something harder to escape. Your life may be shaped less by major turning points and more by thousands of nearly invisible negotiations no one else ever sees. Not grand decisions, micro-decisions, private votes cast under boredom, impatience, frustration, and emotional hunger. And perhaps the most dangerous part is how innocent they feel while they are happening. What made this experiment far more important was not simply whether children waited. It was how they managed to wait. The children who succeeded were often not stronger in the way people imagine. They did not sit there heroically staring temptation in the face through sheer willpower. Many did the opposite. They distracted themselves. They covered the marshmallow, turned away, invented games, looked at the ceiling, talked aloud. They manipulated attention. They changed the psychological meaning of the situation. Mischel eventually described this through what became known as hot and cool systems. The hot system is emotional, impulsive, immediate, reactive. It seeks relief, pleasure, urgency reduction. The cool system is reflective, strategic, cognitive. Creates distance, reframes temptation, buys time. This distinction matters because it destroys one of the most seductive myths about discipline. Discipline is not primarily a personality trait reserved for exceptional people. It is often a system of managing attention and environment before impulse escalates. Not brute force, design. Not heroic resistance, psychological architecture. This changes the entire equation. Because if your environment constantly amplifies your impulses, then every decision feels like combat. Every task drains you. Every promise becomes fragile. But if you reduce friction before the moment of temptation arrives, something remarkable happens. Self-control starts looking less like suffering and more like structure. This is deeply inconvenient, because it means many of the battles you think are moral failures may actually be environmental and attentional failures repeated until they feel personal. This is where the experiment becomes personal, because eventually, life places a version of that marshmallow in front of everyone. Not once, constantly, a message you want to send immediately, a comfort you know will cost you later, a commitment you want to abandon because your emotional state changed. And in those moments, something far more important than pleasure is being negotiated. Your relationship with yourself. Each time you endure a small discomfort without collapsing into immediate relief, you generate evidence. Quiet evidence. Invisible to everyone else, but not invisible to your own nervous system. A new expectation begins to form. Perhaps I can survive urges without obeying them. Perhaps discomfort is not an emergency. Perhaps I do not need to be ruled by what I feel in the next 60 seconds. This is the beginning of a different kind of confidence. Not loud confidence. Not performative certainty. Something more durable. Trust built through accumulated proof. And the tragedy is that most people spend years trying to feel strong before acting, while strength is often being built precisely in the moments that feel least glamorous. Not in breakthroughs, in pauses. Tiny pauses between impulse and action. A few seconds where identity is quietly rewritten. But what almost no one notices is that resisting what is immediately available is only the first layer. Much darker is what happens when the reward is delayed so long that you begin to question whether it is coming at all. The problem begins the moment people place their future in the hands of a feeling. Motivation is seductive because it feels like permission. When it arrives, everything seems possible. Energy rises, clarity sharpens, ambition feels natural. You suddenly believe you are about to become a different person. And because the experience is emotionally intense, it creates a dangerous illusion that progress depends on maintaining this state. But motivation is chemically unstable. It is weather, a psychological spike, not an operating system, which means that if your behavior depends on feeling ready, then your entire life is being governed by something as unreliable as mood. Few people understood this more clearly than Jerry Seinfeld. Long before his name became synonymous with one of the most successful sitcoms in television history, Seinfeld was simply a comedian trying to become consistently better at writing jokes. A young comedian once asked him for advice on improving at stand-up. Seinfeld's response was deceptively simple. Get a large wall calendar. Every day you write jokes. Mark a big red X on that date. After a few days, a chain begins to form. Your only job becomes brutally clear. Do not break the chain. Nothing in this method is glamorous. No optimizastion rituals. No emotional speeches. No mystical inspiration. Just visual evidence of repeated behavior. This matters because the system quietly transfers your attention away from emotional volatility and toward behavioral continuity. The goal is no longer feel creative. The goal is preserve the chain. And in that subtle shift, something profound happens. Action stops being negotiated from scratch every morning. It becomes attached to continuity, to momentum, to identity under construction. Not because you suddenly feel disciplined, but because breaking the pattern begins to feel psychologically expensive. This method works because it bypasses a trap most people never recognize. When behavior depends on internal negotiation, every day becomes a courtroom. You wake up and immediately begin litigating with yourself. Am I tired? Do I feel inspired? Can I skip today and compensate tomorrow? Is today really the best moment? This invisible dialogue is exhausting, not because the task is difficult, but because decision fatigue slowly corrodes execution. Every action must be emotionally justified before it can happen. This is unsustainable. The Seinfeld system removes much of that negotiation. Not through force, but through simplification. The question is no longer whether you feel like doing the task. The question is whether you are willing to create a visible rupture in something you have already invested in. That visual chain becomes more than ink. It becomes continuity made visible. A record, a scoreboard, proof that you are capable of repetition. And this matters at a neurological level. Humans are deeply loss-averse. Once a streak exists, preserving it becomes emotionally charged. Breaking it feels like damage, like regression, like betraying accumulated effort. Suddenly, your mind is no longer trying to maximize comfort. It is trying to avoid rupture. This is a critical shift, because many people assume discipline is built by increasing motivation. But often discipline is built by reducing decision complexity and increasing friction against inconsistency. A simple mark on a calendar sounds almost laughably primitive. Yet primitive systems often outperform sophisticated intentions, because the human brain is less persuaded by abstract goals than by visible patterns it does not want to destroy. And perhaps that is more revealing than most people are comfortable admitting. There is another psychological mechanism hidden inside this practice. At first, a single X means almost nothing. It is too small to generate pride, too insignificant to feel transformative. But after enough repetition, the marks begin to accumulate. A week, 2 weeks, a month. The calendar changes character. What was once empty space becomes evidence, not of achievement, of reliability. And reliability is psychologically powerful because it begins altering self-perception. You are no longer dealing with an isolated action. You are confronting a pattern, a visible narrative about who you have been becoming. This is where many people underestimate the importance of small behaviors. They dismiss them because each individual action appears trivial. One page, one workout, one paragraph, one phone call. But identity is rarely built through dramatic acts. It is compressed into repetition. And repetition leaves residue. Eventually, the calendar is no longer just tracking behavior. It is reflecting a relationship between your present self and your future self. Each X is a message sent forward. I did not disappear today. I showed up again. This quiet repetition has a stabilizing effect that motivation cannot replicate. Because motivation is emotional intensity without memory. A streak is memory externalized. It reminds you who you were yesterday and what you are responsible for preserving today. This is why people often feel strangely calmer once systems replace emotional dependence. Not because the work becomes easier, but because identity begins to feel less chaotic, less improvised, less vulnerable to whatever emotion happens to dominate the morning. This is the brutal simplicity most people spend years avoiding. You do not need to trust your emotions. You need a structure capable of surviving them. The fantasy is always the same. One day you will wake up transformed, focused, driven, naturally disciplined, and from that day forward, consistency will feel organic. But real life rarely grants this cinematic moment. More often, your future is being decided by systems so visually unimpressive they are easy to ignore. A calendar, a mark, a repeated action too small to impress anyone. And yet, beneath this simplicity, something radical is occurring. You are reducing the power of emotional fluctuation over behavioral output. You are removing your feelings from the position of command. This is deeply uncomfortable, because it means your progress may depend less on emotional healing than on behavioral architecture. Less on discovering the perfect state of mind than on creating structures that make inconsistency more inconvenient than action. This is not romantic. It does not flatter the ego. There is nothing grand about marking a calendar. But perhaps that is exactly why it works. It is too small to feel heroic, too repetitive to feel exciting, too boring to feed fantasy, which forces a confrontation most people spend years postponing. What if the life you want is not blocked by lack of potential, intelligence, or vision, but by your inability to repeatedly tolerate the ordinary? There is a comforting lie hidden inside human ambition. It tells you that identity is something waiting to be discovered, a buried essence, a true self concealed beneath confusion, fear, distraction, and bad decisions. People cling to this idea because it is emotionally flattering. It suggests that somewhere beneath the chaos, you are already the person you hope to become. You simply have not accessed it yet. But in 1890, philosopher and psychologist William James offered a far less romantic interpretation. In the Principles of Psychology, James argued that human beings are not primarily shaped by isolated decisions or dramatic moments of self-realization. They are shaped by habit, repeated action, behavior performed so consistently that it gradually escapes conscious negotiation. His language was blunt. He described habit as the enormous flywheel of society, the mechanism through which both individuals and civilizations preserve themselves. A flywheel is not explosive, not cinematic. It gains force through rotation, slowly, incrementally, almost invisibly. This is precisely what makes habit psychologically dangerous and powerful, because each repeated action appears too insignificant to matter. A tone of voice, posture, a reaction under stress, a default response to discomfort, a daily behavior so ordinary it barely registers. And yet James understood something most people resist. Repetition is not merely producing outcomes. It is engraving pathways, reducing resistance, automating identity. The self is not built only from what you consciously believe. It is increasingly outsourced to what you repeatedly do without thinking. which means that every action is performing a quieter function than most people realize. Not simply expressing who you are, training who you become. James was obsessed with the terrifying efficiency of repetition. Not because repetition is glamorous, but because the nervous system is constantly searching for ways to conserve energy. Anything repeated enough times becomes easier, less effortful, less cognitively expensive. This is adaptive. Without habit, life would become neurologically overwhelming. You would have to consciously decide how to walk, eat, speak, react, organize, respond, and function at every moment. Habit reduces this burden, but embedded inside this efficiency is a hidden cost. The brain does not morally discriminate between useful repetition and destructive repetition. It automates both. This means your habits are not asking whether they serve your long-term interests. They are asking only one question: has this been repeated enough to deserve efficiency? This is where James' theory becomes almost brutal, because it means every repeated avoidance is also training. Every repeated excuse is practice. Every emotional escape route is being reinforced. Not symbolically, mechanically. The person who repeatedly postpones difficult conversations is not merely avoiding discomfort. They are rehearsing avoidance. The person who repeatedly abandons commitments under emotional friction is not experiencing random inconsistency. They are installing it, layer by layer, action by action, habit by habit. James warned that habit can become both ally and prison, a force that stabilizes life or calcifies limitation. And most people fail to notice this transition because it is gradual. No dramatic collapse, no visible alarm. Just behavior repeated enough times that it begins to feel natural, then inevitable, then personal. And what was once a choice slowly starts masquerading as personality. This is why James placed extraordinary importance on what he called the formation of new habits. His advice was uncompromising. Launch the new behavior with as much force as possible. Allow no exceptions until the habit is rooted. Act decisively, not because dramatic intensity is inherently superior, but because early repetitions are psychologically formative. The beginning is fragile. At this stage, behaviors are still competing. Old patterns retain gravitational pull. New patterns have little authority. This creates a dangerous period where inconsistency is especially costly. Every exception weakens the emerging structure. Every delay strengthens the previous one. James understood that repetition is not neutral during this phase. It is competitive. One pattern is replacing another, and whichever receives more reinforcement begins to dominate. This is psychologically sobering, because many people imagine change as additive, as if you simply install a better behavior on top of your existing life. But behavioral reality is often more antagonistic. To become someone new, certain patterns must lose territory. Attention must be redirected. Responses interrupted. Defaults destabilized. This is not abstract self-improvement. It is behavioral conflict, a reorganization of automaticity, which explains why change often feels strangely unnatural at first. Not because you are failing, but because you are interfering with systems designed for efficiency. The discomfort is not evidence that something is wrong. It may be evidence that an old pattern is losing uncontested control, and that transition rarely feels graceful. This leaves behind an unsettling implication. You may spend years telling yourself a story about who you are: disciplined, undisciplined, confident, avoidant, focused, chaotic. But according to James, these identities may be less like truths and more like accumulated behavioral residue, a sediment formed through repetition, not fixed character, conditioned momentum. This is both threatening and liberating. Threatening because it strips away comforting narratives. You can no longer hide inside intention, inside potential, inside abstract self-image. Behavior becomes evidence, cold, repetitive, observable evidence. But it is also liberating, because if repetition helped construct what currently feels like personality, then repetition can also destabilize it. What feels permanent may simply be practiced. What feels natural may simply be familiar, and what feels like identity may be nothing more than a pattern that has been repeated long enough to become believable. This forces an uncomfortable confrontation. Perhaps you are not trapped inside some immutable version of yourself. Perhaps you are merely living inside the architecture of your own repetitions. Walls built slowly, reinforced daily, rarely questioned. And if behavior is quietly constructing the self whether you notice it or not, then a darker possibility emerges. What happens when the patterns shaping you are so small, so constant, and so invisible that you no longer even recognize them as choices? There is a psychological mistake people repeat with almost religious devotion. They assume progress must feel dramatic to be real. A breakthrough, a revelation, a visible leap large enough to emotionally justify the effort. Anything smaller is dismissed as insignificant, too slow, too ordinary, too unimpressive to matter. This distortion is destructive because it blinds people to one of the most stabilizing forces available to the human mind. In 2011, researchers Teresa Amabile and Stephen Kramer published findings from a large-scale study later known as the Progress Principle. Their research analyzed nearly 12,000 diary entries from hundreds of employees across multiple organizations. Participants documented daily events, emotions, motivation levels, perceptions of productivity, obstacles, and internal states. What emerged was striking. The most powerful factor influencing positive inner work life was not praise, not salary, not external rewards, not major achievements. It was making progress in meaningful work. Even small progress, especially small progress. This finding seems almost underwhelming at first. Surely humans require larger victories to feel energized. Something visible, something emotionally dramatic. But the data suggested otherwise. A tiny completed step could significantly improve motivation, engagement, and emotional experience. Problem partially solved. Page written. A difficult conversation initiated. A small piece of order restored. Not enough to impress anyone. Enough to generate movement. And movement matters psychologically because stagnation is rarely neutral. When people feel trapped, unfinished, or internally static, their mental state begins to degrade. Progress interrupts this decay. Not by solving everything. By proving something essential, the system is still moving. This changes the emotional meaning of small actions. Most people evaluate their daily behaviors through the lens of scale. Was this enough? Did it matter? Did I accomplish something impressive? If the answer is no, they experience the day as psychologically empty. This is a dangerous miscalculation, because the mind is often less nourished by magnitude than by evidence of forward motion. Amabile and Kramer found that setbacks, ambiguity, blocked progress, and invisible effort had disproportionately negative effects on mood and engagement. Not necessarily because the work was impossible, but because stalled movement creates a subtle form of psychological suffocation. You begin to feel enclosed, static, internally congested. This is why unfinished tasks often carry such disproportionate emotional weight. They are not merely incomplete. They represent suspended motion, unresolved cognitive tension, open loops draining mental bandwidth. By contrast, even a modest completed step generates closure. A signal. Something moved. Something changed. A tiny shift in entropy. This is not trivial. It is regulatory. Small progress stabilizes attention because it reduces helplessness. It restores agency in manageable doses. You are no longer confronting an overwhelming totality. Only the next visible piece. This is where many people sabotage themselves. They create goals psychologically too large to metabolize. The scale crushes engagement before momentum can begin. Then they misinterpret paralysis as lack of discipline. But often the issue is architectural. The nervous system does not always need inspiration. Sometimes it needs evidence that effort still modifies reality. There is another layer hidden beneath this research. Small wins do more than improve mood. They rebuild internal coherence. When you complete even a modest action, you reduce the gap between intention and reality. That gap is psychologically expensive. The larger it becomes, the more fragmented a person begins to feel. Plans accumulate, ideas accumulate, obligations accumulate, but reality remains unchanged. This creates a dangerous identity split, a growing distance between the person you imagine yourself to be and the behavioral evidence surrounding you. Small progress narrows this distance. Not through fantasy, through contact. You thought something, then acted on it. This is deceptively powerful, because every completed action reinforces a basic form of self-trust. A primitive but stabilizing message. I can influence my environment. My behavior still matters. This is why individuals experiencing chaos often benefit disproportionately from very small forms of order. Making the bed, sending the email, organizing one drawer, completing one paragraph. These acts are often mocked for their simplicity. But simplicity is exactly what makes them neurologically useful. They are achievable enough to generate closure without triggering overwhelm. This matters more than most people understand. Psychological stability is not built exclusively from profound insight. It is often rebuilt through repeated contact with manageable completion. Not because the task is important, because the act of completion itself is regulating. A small finished action can do something grand ambition often cannot. Return a fractured mind to movement. This reveals something deeply counterintuitive. Many people believe stability comes after large-scale life change, after fixing everything, after total reinvention, after finally becoming organized, healthy, disciplined, clear, and emotionally aligned. But internal stability often begins much earlier, at a scale almost too small to respect. One completed action, then another, not impressive enough to share, not dramatic enough to celebrate, just enough to interrupt inertia. This is psychologically humbling, because it means your emotional life may be more structurally dependent on tiny forms of progress than on grand transformation. A person can spend months searching for purpose while quietly deteriorating under the weight of stagnation. Not because they lack meaning, but because their system is starving for movement. The tragedy is that people often interpret this depletion incorrectly. They call it lack of motivation, lack of confidence, lack of clarity, when in many cases what is actually missing is something far less abstract. Evidence. Concrete proof that action still produces change, that effort still leaves marks on reality, that the future is not fully sealed. This is why seemingly trivial progress can feel disproportionately relieving. It is not about the task itself. It is about what the task represents. A crack in paralysis, a restoration of agency, a pulse returning to a system that had begun to feel psychologically numb. But what becomes far more dangerous is what happens when progress is no longer visible at all, and you are forced to keep moving without immediate proof that anything is changing. There is a hidden reason progress feels psychologically stabilizing. Not simply because it is emotionally rewarding, not because humans enjoy achievement in some abstract sense, but because repeated interaction with challenge changes the brain itself. In 2000, neuroscientist Eleanor Maguire and her colleagues published a now-famous study on one of the most cognitively demanding professions in London: taxi drivers. To become a licensed London taxi driver, candidates must pass an examination process known simply as the knowledge. This is not a casual test. It requires memorizing approximately 25,000 streets and thousands of landmarks, routes, intersections, hotels, hospitals, theaters, parks, and alternate paths across one of the most geographically complex cities in the world. The training process can take years. Candidates repeatedly study maps, physically navigate routes, rehearse journeys, and mentally simulate travel between arbitrary locations. This is cognitive endurance, navigation under repetition, constant environmental updating. Maguire wanted to understand whether this sustained demand left measurable traces in the brain. Using structural MRI scans, her team compared licensed London taxi drivers with control subjects. The findings were extraordinary. Taxi drivers showed structural differences in the hippocampus, a brain region heavily involved in spatial memory and navigation. Specifically, The posterior hippocampus was larger in taxi drivers than in non-drivers. Even more striking, the volume appeared correlated with years of experience. The longer they had been navigating, the more pronounced the adaptation. This was not metaphor, not motivational rhetoric. Repeated effort had left anatomical fingerprints. The brain had physically reorganized in response to sustained demand. This changes the emotional meaning of repetition, because what feels like tedious practice on the surface may be biological remodeling underneath. And most people dramatically underestimate how much evidence the nervous system requires before it begins to trust a new capability. This finding carries a brutal implication. Competence is not merely learned conceptually. It is installed through exposure, repeated contact with complexity, repeated correction, repeated orientation under uncertainty. The London taxi driver does not wake up one day suddenly feeling capable of navigating a labyrinthine city. Capability emerges through accumulated evidence. Street after street, route after route, error after error, correction after correction. The nervous system updates through contact with reality, not imagination, not self-affirmation, not intention, reality. This is deeply inconvenient for anyone searching for rapid internal transformation, because confidence is often mistaken for a mindset, a belief one can adopt through perspective shifts, motivational content, or emotional priming. But the McGuire study points somewhere less glamorous. The brain is conservative. It does not hand out trust cheaply. It wants proof, repeated proof, environmental proof, sensorimotor proof, cognitive proof. This is rational. A system designed for survival should not rapidly overestimate competence. It should calibrate slowly, which means the discomfort people feel while developing new abilities is often not evidence of inadequacy. It is evidence of insufficient accumulated exposure. The structure has not yet updated. The map is still incomplete. And because humans are emotionally impatient, this lag becomes dangerous. People often abandon repetition during the exact period where adaptation is occurring invisibly.
No imuuschen el rigor. No visible transformation.
No obvious sign that anything is changing. And yet, beneath the surface, recalibration may already be underway. This helps explain a common psychological distortion. People often assume they are not improving because they do not yet feel different. Still uncertain, still effortful, still awkward, still mentally noisy, so they conclude nothing is happening. This is often false. Adaptation is frequently asymmetrical. The internal experience remains unstable long after structural changes begin. You still feel like a beginner while the system is quietly reorganizing. This is one of the most demoralizing phases of development. High effort, low emotional reward, minimal visible feedback, and yet potentially high adaptation. The London taxi drivers likely did not perceive their hippocampi changing. They were not rewarded with dramatic internal sensations announcing neural remodeling.
No revelation. No cinematic shift.
Just repetition. Years of repetition. This matters because many people are addicted to felt progress. They trust only what can be emotionally detected. But biological change does not operate according to emotional preference. It obeys exposure, load, frequency, duration, demand. This means your subjective experience is not always a reliable measure of transformation. Feeling unchanged does not prove stasis. Feeling uncertain does not prove failure. Feeling resistance does not prove incapacity. Sometimes the most important developments are occurring beneath conscious perception. Quietly, slowly, without permission from your emotional state. This is psychologically difficult to tolerate, because it demands faith in a process that may not yet be perceptible. And most people are far less patient with invisible growth than they claim to be. This leads to a harder truth. Trust in yourself is not usually granted through declaration, not through saying you are capable, not through deciding to believe in yourself, not through emotionally intense promises made during temporary clarity. Trust is granted through accumulated prediction. Your nervous system begins to believe in you when your behavior becomes reliably associated with adaptation. Challenge appears. You engage. You repeat. You survive. You update. Again, and again, and again. This is what the London taxi drivers unknowingly demonstrated. A system exposed to sufficient repetition eventually reorganizes around competence. Not because it was convinced, because it was conditioned. This is far less glamorous than most people want. There is no shortcut hidden inside it.
No hay mouse en el bypass.
No identity leap performed through thought alone. Only repeated contact with what once felt cognitively overwhelming until it no longer does. And perhaps this is why so many people remain trapped. Not because they are incapable of change, but because they withdraw before the brain has collected enough evidence to justify a new internal prediction. They leave the process too early. They interrupt the proof. They demand trust before the system has finished calibrating. And what almost nobody is prepared for is what happens when action must continue even in the total absence of emotional reassurance, external reward, or visible progress. That is where the real fracture begins. One of the most dangerous beliefs a human being can adopt sounds almost harmless. I will act when I feel better. At first, it appears reasonable. Why force movement when energy is low? Why initiate effort when the mind feels heavy, numb, resistant, depleted? Surely emotion should improve first. Surely motivation should return before meaningful behavior becomes possible. This logic feels compassionate. It is often psychologically disastrous, because emotional states are not always reliable initiators of action. Sometimes they are consequences of it. In the 1970s, psychologist Peter Lewinson began developing what would later become known as behavioral activation, a treatment approach for depression built on a deceptively simple principle. Instead of waiting for mood improvement before changing behavior, patients were encouraged to systematically engage in activities first. Planned activity, structured behavior, meaningful or reinforcing tasks performed regardless of current emotional state. This challenged a deeply intuitive assumption. That emotion must precede action. That feeling better is the entry point. Lewinson's work suggested the opposite. In many depressive cycles, withdrawal creates environmental impoverishment. Less movement, less social interaction, less reinforcement, less exposure to rewarding experiences. The system narrows. Life becomes behaviorally smaller, and as engagement decreases, mood often deteriorates further. This creates a closed loop. Low mood reduces action. Reduced action reduces opportunity for reinforcement. Reduced reinforcement deepens low mood, a psychological contraction spiral. Behavioral activation interrupts this loop from the outside. Not by negotiating with emotion, by modifying behavior directly. This is uncomfortable because it violates instinct. You do not wait for readiness. You behave first. And for many people, this feels almost offensive, as if action without emotional permission is somehow artificial. But Lewinson's work exposed something unsettling. Sometimes waiting for the right feeling is precisely what keeps suffering mechanically intact. This reverses a deeply ingrained psychological hierarchy. Most people treat feelings as commanders. If energy is present, action follows. If motivation appears, effort begins. If confidence rises, risk becomes tolerable. Emotion is positioned as authority. Behavior becomes subordinate. But behavioral activation destabilizes this hierarchy. It treats action not as the obedient follower of mood, but as an independent lever, something capable of influencing emotional state rather than merely reflecting it. This is profoundly important, because when behavior becomes fully dependent on internal state, life becomes vulnerable to fluctuation. A bad morning can derail an entire day. A period of sadness can collapse routines. Anxiety can suspend decisions indefinitely. Mood becomes dictator. Action becomes hostage. Lewinson's model challenged this passivity. Patients were not asked whether they felt inspired. They were asked to engage, schedule activities, increase contact with reinforcing experiences, create opportunities for movement, mastery, connection, or pleasure. Sometimes these actions were very small. Walking, calling someone, leaving the house, completing a task, attending an event, not because the task itself was magical, but because behavioral engagement changes environmental input. It increases contact with life. This matters more than it seems. Mood does not exist in a vacuum. It is partially shaped by what you repeatedly expose yourself to. Withdraw from life long enough, and your emotional world becomes narrower, less varied, less stimulated, less rewarding. Behavioral activation reopens channels that withdrawal had slowly sealed shut. Not through insight alone, through contact. This is where many people become trapped. They assume their emotional reality is final, when in fact, part of what they are feeling may simply be the consequence of a life that has become behaviorally too small. There is something psychologically radical in this approach. It does not require emotional agreement. This sounds simple. It is not. Many people are unconsciously waiting for internal consensus before they act. A sense of alignment, permission, readiness, a felt reduction in resistance. Only then does behavior seem legitimate. Behavioral activation rejects this dependency. You can act while unconvinced. You can move while emotionally flat. You can engage while still carrying resistance. This does not make the action fraudulent. It makes it strategic, because emotional systems are often lagging indicators. They do not instantly update alongside new behavior. You may begin healthier routines while still feeling unhealthy. Begin reconnecting socially while still feeling isolated. Begin productive work while still feeling unfocused. This temporal mismatch is uncomfortable. The behavior changes first. The emotional state may follow later, or gradually, or unevenly. This is where many people quit. They interpret the absence of immediate emotional improvement as proof that the action is ineffective. Nothing feels different, therefore nothing is changing. But behavioral activation depends precisely on tolerating this lag. Continuing action before emotional evidence arrives. This is psychologically demanding, because it requires behavior without reassurance, movement without immediate reward, a willingness to let action lead while emotion catches up slowly behind. And perhaps this is one of the most adult psychological skills imaginable. Not acting because you feel aligned. Acting because alignment is sometimes built through movement itself. This leaves behind an uncomfortable possibility. Much of what people call lack of motivation may not be a deficit of desire. It may be a behavioral stalemate, a system waiting for a condition that will never arrive on its own. Waiting to feel ready, waiting to feel clear, waiting to feel energized enough to begin. Meanwhile, life contracts further. The environment grows quieter, more repetitive, more behaviorally impoverished, and the absence of action begins to masquerade as personality. I am lazy. I am broken. I am incapable. But behavioral activation suggests a less fatalistic interpretation. Perhaps you are not describing identity. Perhaps you are describing a loop maintained by passivity, avoidance, low reinforcement, and emotional dependency. And loops can be interrupted, not through revelation, through behavior. This is both hopeful and brutal. Hopeful because it means change is not always locked behind emotional transformation. Brutal because it removes a convenient excuse. You may not need to feel different before acting. You may need to act while feeling exactly the same. This is where the mind often resists hardest, because it wants certainty before movement, comfort before effort, relief before engagement. But life rarely negotiates on those terms. And what becomes even more unsettling is what happens when there is no external system, no therapist, no structure forcing movement at all. Only you, alone, facing the silent decision to either move without permission or remain exactly where you are. There is a moment when the mind stops negotiating. Not because the situation becomes easier. Not because fear disappears. Not because exhaustion suddenly lifts. But because resistance itself becomes too expensive to maintain. This threshold is deliberately engineered inside one of the most punishing military selection processes in the world, Navy SEAL Hell Week. Part of basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, Hell Week is designed to expose candidates to sustained physical and psychological hardship under extreme conditions. For approximately 5.5 days, trainees endure near-continuous activity with minimal sleep, often totaling only a few hours across the entire period. Cold water immersion, long-distance running, boat carries,
Obstacle course.
sand exposure, physical drills, load-bearing tasks, constant evaluation. Pain is not incidental. Fatigue is not accidental. The structure is intentional. The objective is not simply to identify physical strength. Many physically capable candidates fail. The deeper purpose is stress inoculation. Repeated exposure to controlled adversity under conditions where comfort is systematically removed. The body is exhausted. The environment is hostile. Decision-making degrades. Emotion becomes volatile. And under these conditions, something revealing happens. The usual psychological bargaining begins to collapse. The endless internal dialogue. One more excuse. One more delay. One more reason to stop. At some point, candidates can no longer afford the metabolic cost of constant resistance. Action becomes simpler than hesitation. Movement becomes cleaner than negotiation. This is psychologically significant, because much of ordinary suffering is amplified by internal friction. Not only by difficulty itself, but by the energy consumed resisting difficulty. Hell Week strips this luxury away. Under enough repetition, the mind is forced into a different relationship with discomfort. Not because discomfort is gone, because avoidance is no longer a viable strategy. This reveals something uncomfortable about resilience. People often imagine toughness as an inherited trait, personality type, a natural emotional advantage possessed by certain individuals. Fearless, mentally stronger, more disciplined by default. But environments like Hell Week suggest something less mystical. Psychological hardness can be conditioned, not perfectly, not universally, but measurably, through repeated contact with voluntarily endured hardship. This is critical, because the nervous system recalibrates according to what it repeatedly survives. Cold exposure endured, fatigue endured, sleep deprivation endured, stress endured, uncertainty endured. The threshold for what feels intolerable begins to shift. What once triggered alarm may gradually register as manageable. Not pleasant, manageable. This distinction matters. Confidence is often misunderstood as absence of discomfort. But many high-performing systems are not comfortable. They are adapted. They have learned through repeated exposure that discomfort is survivable. This dramatically changes behavioral response. The untrained mind interprets friction as stop signal. The adapted mind increasingly interprets friction as familiar terrain, not emergency.
Terrain.
This is why repeated controlled hardship can create a form of grounded confidence unavailable through comfort seeking. Not because suffering is inherently noble. It is not. Unnecessary suffering is not wisdom. But systematically chosen discomfort under meaningful structure can alter internal prediction systems. You survive what once felt impossible. Then the nervous system updates. The map changes. And with it, your estimate of yourself changes too. Not because you declared yourself stronger, because reality supplied evidence under pressure. There is another psychological mechanism hidden here. Hell Week is not merely about enduring pain. It is about reducing the perceived authority of emotional resistance. Under ordinary conditions, discomfort is persuasive. Tiredness argues. Fear argues. Boredom argues. Pain argues. The mind presents sensation as instruction. You feel something unpleasant, then infer behavioral meaning from it. Stop, retreat, delay, protect. But repeated exposure under structured hardship weakens this association. Candidates continue functioning while tired, continue while cold, continue while afraid, continue while miserable. This creates a critical cognitive separation. Discomfort and decision become less fused. You begin learning a difficult truth. An unpleasant state is not automatically a command. This sounds simple. It is psychologically transformative. Because many people live under constant emotional governance. They obey every internal fluctuation as if it were authoritative. Low energy means no work. Anxiety means no action. Resistance means no progress. But repeated hardship reveals a more nuanced reality. Internal states provide information, not absolute law. This is a radical shift in agency. Emotion is no longer sovereign. It becomes one signal among many, relevant but not final. This dramatically expands behavioral freedom. You are less controlled by what you feel in the moment, more capable of maintaining action under imperfect internal conditions. And perhaps this is one reason extreme training environments leave such durable psychological imprints. They force direct confrontation with a truth most people avoid for years. Your feelings are often loud. They are not always in charge. This leaves behind a harder question. What actually makes a person trust themselves under pressure? Not in theory, not in calm conditions, not during motivational clarity, under strain, under fatigue, under fear. Hell Week suggests a blunt answer. Trust is built when you repeatedly witness yourself continuing under conditions where you previously assumed you would stop. You survive your own prediction errors. You discover your internal estimates were incomplete, too conservative, too fragile, too narrow. This is profoundly destabilizing and strengthening at once. Part of your old self-concept must collapse. The version of you organized around avoidance begins losing credibility. Not because someone convinced you otherwise, because your own behavior contradicted it repeatedly. This is where confidence becomes less performative, less verbal, less dependent on image. It becomes memory, stored evidence, a database of endured conditions. But there is a limit to what external hardship can teach. Because surviving structured adversity is one thing. Far more psychologically revealing is what happens when no instructor is watching, no system is imposing pressure, no environment is manufacturing consequence. And you must decide entirely alone whether to keep your word to yourself or quietly betray it again. That is where endurance stops being physical and becomes something far more intimate. After the devastation of World War II, Japan faced a brutal reality. Resources were scarce. Infrastructure was damaged. Industrial capacity was fragile. There was no luxury for waste, inefficiency, or grand reckless experimentation. Inside this constraint, something deceptively simple began to emerge. At Toyota, under the influence of engineers and thinkers like Taichi Ono, a philosophy developed that would later become globally influential: Kaizen. Continuous improvement. Not revolution. Not dramatic transformation. Not periodic reinvention. Relentless micro-improvement embedded into daily systems. The principle was almost offensively modest. Instead of asking how to radically overhaul an entire process, the system asked smaller questions. What can be improved here? What inefficiency can be reduced today? What friction can be removed? What tiny refinement makes this process cleaner, safer, faster, more reliable? Then the same question again, and again, and again. This was not merely an operational strategy. It was a cultural discipline, an orientation toward reality built on iterative refinement. Small changes accumulated, tiny corrections compounded, waste reduced, processes stabilized, systems strengthened. Over time, this generated extraordinary outcomes, not because of one brilliant leap, because of thousands of unglamorous adjustments repeated consistently. This is psychologically important, because Kaizen rejects a fantasy deeply embedded in human behavior, the fantasy of total transformation, the seductive belief that meaningful change must arrive through dramatic intensity. A fresh start, a new identity, a clean break from the past. Kaizen offers something less emotionally exciting and far more durable. Improvement as repetition, respect built incrementally, stability emerging through maintenance, not spectacle. This logic applies far beyond factories, because a human life is also a system, and systems are rarely transformed by occasional intensity. They are shaped by what is repeatedly adjusted. This is what makes Kaizen psychologically radical. It removes the emotional drama from self-improvement. There is no dependence on inspiration, no worship of motivation, no obsession with perfect conditions, only process examination, adjustment, iteration, refinement. This is profoundly stabilizing because it shifts attention away from identity fantasy and toward operational reality. Not who do I want to become, but what can be improved within the current system. This is less glamorous. It is also more honest, because much of personal suffering is intensified by scale distortion. People attempt to redesign their entire lives in one burst of emotional energy. New routines, new goals, new beliefs, new standards, total behavioral overhaul, then collapse predictably under the weight of unsustainable change. Kaizen avoids this trap. The target is small enough to survive contact with reality. One refinement, one improvement, one inefficiency reduced, one repeated friction point addressed. This generates a psychologically important byproduct: consistency without excessive volatility. The system does not depend on emotional surges. It depends on ongoing maintenance. This is how robustness is built. Not by becoming someone else overnight, by making the current system marginally better repeatedly. Over time, these marginal improvements stop being marginal. Their effects compound. The system becomes more coherent, more reliable, less wasteful, less chaotic, and perhaps most importantly, less dependent on emotional intensity to function. This is what many people misunderstand. Self-respect is rarely born from dramatic declarations. It often emerges from repeated evidence that you are capable of maintaining and improving what you already have. There is a deeper psychological elegance hidden inside this philosophy. Kaizen assumes imperfection is permanent, not as failure, as operating condition. There will always be friction, waste, error, redundancy, blind spots, bottlenecks. Human systems are never complete, never permanently optimized, never finished. This is psychologically liberating because it dismantles another destructive illusion: the fantasy of arrival, the belief that one day you will finally become fully organized, fully disciplined, fully healed, fully in control. And from that point onward, maintenance will no longer be necessary. Kaizen rejects this fantasy entirely. The work is never finished. Improvement is not an event. It is a relationship, a mode of engagement with reality. This is emotionally humbling because it means you are not building toward permanent exemption from effort. You are building capacity to participate in ongoing refinement, not perfection.
Participation.
This subtle shift changes everything. The objective is no longer to become flawless. It is to remain responsive, attentive, adaptive, capable of correction. This dramatically reduces the psychological violence people often inflict on themselves. Failure is no longer interpreted as identity collapse. It becomes feedback, a location marker indicating where the next refinement may be needed. This is operational maturity, and perhaps one of the most psychologically stabilizing perspectives available. You do not need to become complete. You need to remain in relationship with improvement. And perhaps this is what respect for oneself actually looks like when stripped of performance. Not admiration, not inflated confidence, not constant self-approval. Something quieter, more durable, a willingness to remain engaged in maintenance, to notice what is inefficient, misaligned, neglected, or deteriorating, and address it without drama, without fantasy, without waiting for a better emotional season. This is deeply unromantic, and precisely why it works, because respect is often less about how you feel toward yourself and more about how you repeatedly treat what is under your care. Your body, your environment, your routines, your commitments, your attention, your word. Tiny acts repeated long enough begin to communicate something powerful. I do not abandon what matters to me, not perfectly, not heroically, consistently enough to remain in relationship with it. This is the architecture of self-respect, not grand emotion, maintenance, repair, adjustment,
Participation.
Again and again, until the evidence becomes difficult to ignore. But hidden beneath this quiet discipline is a final, uncomfortable truth. Many people do not fail because change is impossible. They fail because deep down, they are still emotionally addicted to dramatic collapse and reinvention. And until that addiction is confronted, even the smallest act of consistency will continue to feel strangely intolerable. There is a version of self-betrayal that looks socially acceptable. It does not announce itself as destruction. It often disguises itself as softness, as patience, as self-understanding, as giving yourself space. You tell yourself you are being compassionate. You are tired, overwhelmed, not in the right headspace. You deserve rest. You deserve gentleness. And sometimes this is true. Recovery is real. Limits are real. Exhaustion is real. But there is a line most people quietly cross without noticing. A line where compassion mutates into permission. Permission to postpone. Permission to dilute standards. Permission to repeatedly delay what you already know matters. Not once. Repeatedly. This is where something dangerous begins. Because the mind is always observing your behavior. Always collecting evidence. Not what you say. Not what you intend. What you repeatedly allow. Each time you negotiate away a commitment you privately considered important, something subtle happens. Your internal authority weakens. Not dramatically, quietly, almost invisibly. The damage is cumulative. One ignored promise. One postponed decision. One abandoned routine. One diluted standard. The cost is rarely external at first. It is structural. A small fracture in self-trust. Then another. And another, until eventually you begin experiencing yourself as unreliable. Not because of catastrophe, because of erosion. This is why some people feel strangely disconnected from themselves. Not lost in one major failure. Lost through microscopic acts of tolerated inconsistency. Nothing exploded. Nothing dramatic happened. They simply stopped being someone their own nervous system could confidently believe. What makes this more unsettling is how invisible the process feels while it is happening.
No alarm sounds.
No dramatic collapse announces itself. No external authority intervenes. Life often allows enormous amounts of silent decay. You can function, work, socialize, appear normal, smile, make plans, speak intelligently about change. All while privately accumulating evidence that your words and actions are increasingly disconnected. This split is psychologically expensive, because identity fragmentation rarely feels like one clean break. It feels like chronic internal static, a low-grade tension difficult to name. You begin hesitating around your own intentions, doubting your own commitments, questioning whether promises made in moments of clarity have any real substance. The mind becomes skeptical of itself. This is not abstract. It changes behavior. Decision-making becomes weaker. Ambition becomes less believable. Future planning feels emotionally hollow. Why trust a projection of yourself that your own history has repeatedly contradicted? This is where many people mistakenly search for more inspiration. More books, more strategies, more emotional fuel. But the issue is often not informational. It is evidential. The mind does not need another speech. It needs new data, a different behavioral pattern repeated long enough to challenge the old conclusion, that you cannot be depended upon by yourself. This is brutal, because no one can manufacture this evidence for you. No external validation can substitute for it. No praise repairs this fracture. Only behavior does, quietly, repeatedly, without witness. There is no emotionally satisfying shortcut out of this. This is what makes the process so offensive to the ego. It is painfully ordinary.
No dramatic awakening.
No single moment of irreversible transformation.
No cinematic redemption.
Only repetition, often boring, often inconvenient, often invisible to everyone except you. This is intolerable to a mind addicted to emotional intensity. Because intensity feels meaningful. Drama feels like progress. Collapse followed by reinvention feels psychologically stimulating, creates narrative, identity theater, a sense that something significant is happening. But repetition offers none of this. It is emotionally flat, austere, unimpressive, and yet it is precisely here that identity is quietly reorganized. Not during emotional peaks, during ordinary maintenance. The decision to do what you said, again and again, without applause, without urgency, without crisis-forcing movement. This is why consistency can feel strangely uncomfortable. Not because it is difficult in the obvious sense, but because it deprives the psyche of drama as identity fuel. You are no longer becoming through chaos. You are becoming through maintenance. And for many people, this feels almost existentially unfamiliar. Who are you if your life is no longer organized around repeated collapse and recovery? Who are you without the emotional intensity of constantly rebuilding yourself? This question is rarely asked directly, but it sits underneath far more behavior than most people realize. Eventually, every person encounters the same private confrontation. No audience, no performance, no philosophy sophisticated enough to negotiate around it. Only a simple question repeated across years. Can you remain loyal to what you know matters when emotion offers no immediate reward? Not once, repeatedly, under boredom, under resistance, under ordinary life. This is where character stops being an abstract virtue and becomes visible architecture. Not in exceptional moments, in recurring ones. Tiny decisions so small they seem insignificant, until they are repeated often enough to become structural. A person is not built through grand declarations. A person is built through accumulated proof. Evidence layered over time until identity is no longer theoretical. Until your own nervous system stops needing persuasion, stops needing promises, stops needing explanation, because it has seen enough. Enough continuity, enough alignment, enough behavioral honesty. And when that happens, something unusually quiet begins to emerge. Not excitement, not pride, something sturdier, a kind of internal stillness, the absence of argument with yourself. A life becomes lighter when it is no longer carrying the weight of self-betrayal. And in the end, confidence was never the reward for feeling powerful. It was the consequence of becoming someone your own mind no longer has to doubt.